You're fine, Sydney. Sydney, it might help. *6 on your phone will mute your phone, and you can also just mute the audio on your computer. Like keep your computer on,
Okay.
but mute it.
Okay, gotcha. Okay, thank you.
Okay, and if we do end up having other issues, I do have the capability of muting from the host account. Okay, Lisa, are you ready? Well, you already told me you're ready.
Yes, sir.
Thanks. Let's go on the record. Today is Thursday, April 22nd, 2021. This is a continuation of the evidentiary hearing in file number EO-2020-0227. All of the counsel are in attendance, and we left off completing Mr. Fortson's testimony yesterday. So today we will start with Ms. Tandy. If Ms. Tandy could speak up, and I will swear you in.
Good morning, Judge. This is Cindy.
Thank you. Hold on just a second. Do you solemnly swear or affirm that the testimony you give in this hearing will be the truth?
I do.
Thank you. And Mr. Keevil, you're a witness.
Thank you, Judge. Can you hear me?
Yes, please go ahead.
Thank you. Ms. Tandy, would you first please state your name and spell it for the record?
Yes, Cynthia M. Tandy, Cynthia C-Y-N-T-H-I-A, M. Tandy is T as in Tom, A-N-D-Y.
Thank you. Have you caused to be prepared for this case direct testimony and rebuttal testimony?
Yes, I did.
And Judge, let me get Ms. Tandy's direct marked as exhibit. I believe I'm up to 102, and Ms. Tandy's rebuttal as exhibit 103. Ms. Tandy, you heard me mention the exhibit numbers there. Your direct exhibit 102 and your rebuttal exhibit 103. Do you have any corrections or additions you need to make to either of those pieces of testimony?
Yes, I do. On exhibit 103, my title has changed since I produced this, and I am now Senior Utility Regulatory Auditor.
Okay, what can you give me a page?
It's on page 1, the second question and the answer to that question, line 11.
Okay, thank you. And that's only in your rebuttal? It's not also in your direct?
Oh, yeah, you're right. It's probably wrong in there also. That's correct. Mr. Keevil. It should be Senior Utility Regulatory Auditor, both on line
Okay.
11.
All right, in both pieces of testimony. With any other corrections or additions to either of the pieces of testimony?
No.
And did you also contribute certain sections to the staff's reports which were attached to Mr. Fortson's direct testimony?
Yes, I did.
All right. If I were to ask you the questions contained in the Exhibits 102 and 103, as you've corrected them here this morning, would your answers be the same as contained in those pieces of testimony?
Yes, they are.
And are those answers true and correct to the best of your knowledge and information?
Yes, they are.
Judge, with that, I would offer Exhibits 102 and 103 into the record and tender Ms. Tandy for cross-examination on, I believe she's here for issue 7 on the issues list.
Thank you, Mr. Keevil. Are there any objections to the admission of Exhibit 102 and Exhibit 103? Let the record reflect there are no objections. The exhibits are so admitted. And the witness has been tendered to Mr. Hall.
Thank you, Judge. I have no questions.
Thank you, Mr. Hall. And now we turn to Avergee.
No questions, Your Honor.
Thank you. Are there any commissioner questions? And we are at commissioner questions for Ms. Tandy. We'll go on to bench questions. Ms. Tandy, I've asked this of several witnesses. Can you tell me how many curtailment events were called, broken down by Avergee, Metro and West, and by the residential and the DRI program?
I'm sorry, Judge, I did not take part of that section in the report.
Okay, that is fine. That does, I think, qualify as for recross. If anyone has any recross, I don't see any. And Mr. Keevil, any redirect?
No, Your Honor, no redirect.
All right, thank you, sir. Ms. Tandy, you are excused. And our next witness is Mr. Lubert. Mr. Lubert, if you could speak up, I will swear you in.
Good morning, Judge.
Do you solemnly swear or affirm that the testimony you give in this hearing will be the truth?
Yes, I do.
Thank you, sir. Mr. Keevil, your witness.
Thank you, Judge. Excuse me, Mr. Lubert, would you please state your name and spell it for the record?
Yeah, my name is Jay Lubert, Luebbert.
And are you the same Jay Lubert who is caused to be prepared in this matter, both direct and rebuttal testimony, which, Judge, I would ask that Mr. Lubert's direct be marked as Exhibit 104 and his rebuttal be marked as Exhibit 105. And I would also note, Your Honor, that both the direct and the rebuttal have both public and confidential versions. So for numbering, we would have 104 public and 104 confidential, as well as 105 public and 105 confidential. Mr. Lubert, are Exhibits 104 and 105, well, you heard me refer direct as 104, rebuttal as 105. Are those the pieces of testimony that you caused to be prepared for this hearing?
Yes.
And did you also contribute to the staff's reports which were attached to Mr. Fortson's direct testimony in this matter?
Yes, I did.
Do you have any additions or corrections that you need to make to either of those pieces of testimony, 104 or 105?
No.
If I were to ask you the questions contained therein, would your answers be the same today as they are contained in those pieces of testimony?
Yes.
And are those answers true and correct to the best of your information, knowledge, and belief?
Yes.
Judge, I would offer exhibits 104 public and 104 confidential and 105 public and 105 confidential into the record.
Thank you, Mr. Keevil. I will take all up as one question. Are there any objections to the admission of any of the exhibits Mr. Keevil just listed, which includes the direct of Mr. Lubert, Exhibit 104, public and confidential, and the surrebuttal of Mr. Lubert, 105, public and confidential? Seeing no objections, it is so admitted, and the witness has been tendered. Mr. Hall, any questions?
Yes, Your Honor. Thank you. Good morning, Mr. Lubert.
Good morning.
Mr. Lubert, do you have a copy of your surrebuttal testimony in front of you?
If you'll give me just a moment, I can pull it up. Okay.
Could you please turn your attention to pages 6 and 7 and let me know when you're there?
Okay.
I'm looking at the portion of your answer starting on line 19 on page 6, going to line 9 on page 7. I'm trying to break that down into layman's terms. In this answer, are you saying that Avergee did not defer a future combustion turbine investment through its MIA Cycle 2 programs?
Mr. Hall, I'm not really objecting, but I don't see a question. From your question, it seemed like his answer began on line 19. I believe that answer starts several lines earlier, just for clarification purposes.
Yes, thank you for that, Mr. Keevil. The full answer does start on line 9 on page 6.
Thank you.
I'm sorry, can you repeat the question?
Sure, Mr. Lubert, I'm reading in reading this answer, I'm trying to break this down to brass tacks. In this answer, are you saying that Avergee did not defer a future combustion turbine investment through its implementation of its MIA Cycle 2 programs?
I think specifically for the demand response programs, which I'm addressing in this review, the demand response programs, the life of those programs ended as soon as the end of Cycle 2 occurred. So to the extent that a substantial deferral of a combustion turbine did not occur before then, it will not occur in the future due to the implementation of the DRI programs in 2018 and 2019. Does that answer your question?
So you specified the DRI programs. What about the thermostat programs?
I would say that the same holds true for them as well. They will require continued program funding and basically a continued increase in program funding in order to possibly realize some benefit out in the future. But the funding that occurred in 2018 and 2019, I don't believe has deferred any combustion turbine.
If there was no deferral, what is used as an avoided cost calculation in the EM&V process for these assets, both DRI and the thermostat program?
So what was used in the EM&V process for all of the programs was what I've quoted here as on page 7 as the proxy avoided capacity costs, which the company came up with in their application for cycle 2 as a proxy for the levelized annual cost of a simple cycle natural gas combustion turbine. So that value is provided to the EM&V contractors, and those values are then multiplied by any demand savings which occurred in the implementation year. That's not to say that those. Sorry, go ahead.
No, please finish your answer.
I was going to say that's not to say that those quote unquote benefits that are used in that EM&V process are ever actually realized by ratepayers through a reduction in their bills.
When you're referring to the savings, are for Avergee's programs, are the savings always measured as actual kilowatts saved, or is there an estimation that's going on as well?
There's always an estimation when they're trying to determine what those savings are. The EM&V process is really there to try to make those estimates on the kilowatts and the kilowatt hours saved as accurate as they can. But there are always, there's generalizations that are occurring there and assumptions that are used in order to estimate those.
Are any of the savings deemed?
Yes.
Were any of the savings deemed for the demand for the cycle 2 programs?
I think the timing changes my answer. So when you're looking at the application for approval of the programs, any of the savings that are assumed there are just that. They're assumptions that haven't been verified to that point and haven't gone through the EM&V process to kind of make sure that they, at least as closely as possible, reflect reality as far as the kilowatt savings.
From that answer, I take it you mean that through the EM&V process, there's a verification of savings, but you had also said earlier that even with verified savings, there's not necessarily what you called benefits. Why are there not benefits even if there's savings?
So just because a demand side program saves or decreases demand does not necessarily mean that customers avoided paying for a combustion turbine for that same amount of demand. So to kind of explain this a little bit better, when they're looking at the levelized cost of the combustion turbine, they break that down into dollars per kilowatt year. And so that number is then multiplied by the kilowatt savings found through the EM&V process. But that's not to say that customers' rates are going to reflect a reduction by that amount based on that demand savings in years 2018 and 2019. One thing that is kind of important to keep in mind is that for the vast majority of programs, the EM&V process is looking at a scope or a measure life or an average measure life for a program that can be up to 20 years long. That's really not the case for a demand response program because of the fact that as soon as the cycle is over, those savings are no longer there for customers unless customers continually fund additional demand response programs and increase that amount that they're paying year over year over year. So by the end of 2019, to the extent that a combustion
Mr. Lupert, are you still there?
reductions from
Mr. Lupert, you cut out a little bit right after you had mentioned a 20-year life of the asset. Could you please restart your answer from there?
Yeah, can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Okay, sorry about that. That's the second time that I've cut out this morning. So if it happens again, please don't hesitate to let me know. So for a typical program, you're looking at measure lives that can go up to 20 years. With the demand response programs, it's really it's a different type of program in that at the end of 2019, customers will no longer be receiving any demand reduction from the demand response incentive program or the residential programmable thermostat program unless they continue to pay for additional program costs in 2020 and on, right? So to the extent that by the end of 2019, you haven't deferred a combustion turbine based on those demand reductions for demand response, you're not going to recognize those benefits at some point in the future because your demand impact from that program is over. So what I've based a large majority of my recommendation on are the benefits that could have been realized in the short term in 2018 and 2019, which were identified as potential benefits by the company, but that they failed to even attempt to achieve.
So, Mr. Looper, let me attempt to restate your answer. In EM&V, proxy avoided costs are applied to savings to have a representation of, and I'm putting quotation marks around this word, benefits. Do I understand that correctly?
Yes.
But if there isn't an actual avoided cost, then the proxy avoided cost is overstated.
Yes, and any analysis that you would look at for as far as whether a program is cost effective is likely skewed by that result.
So if avoided costs, if proxy avoided costs are overstated, both cost effectiveness and benefits are going to be overstated at the end.
Yes.
Even if there are savings from, even if there are kilowatt hour savings from these programs.
I think I would say if there were kilowatt savings as in demand from the programs for these specifically, but yes.
Thank you for that clarification. I have no further questions.
Thank you, Mr. Hall. We turn to Avergee for cross-exam.
Thank you, Your Honor. Good morning, Mr. Lupert. How are you today?
Good morning. I'm doing well.
I'd like to, I sent over, what was it, 2 days ago now, a couple of exhibits, what's been marked as Avergee's Exhibit 1 and 2. I'm going to refer to those. Do you have those by any chance?
If you could tell me the title of each exhibit, that'd be helpful.
Sure. Exhibit number 1 is the stipulation and agreement. It's a pleading entitled Stipulation and Agreement Regarding Extension of MIA 2 Programs During Pendency of MIA 3 Case. And then exhibit number 2 is the order approving that stipulation and agreement.
Okay, give me just a moment to get those pulled up.
You bet.
Okay, so I've got the stipulation and agreement regarding extension of MIA 2 pulled up.
Great.
And then
So-
you said the report and order.
Yeah, the report and order is number 2.
Okay, I think I've got them.
Okay. And kind of working backwards here. So on exhibit number 2, that order approving the stipulation and agreement was issued and became effective February 27th of 2019. Is that correct?
It looks like the issue date was the 27th, and then the effective date was March 17th, 2019.
Thank you. So on exhibit 1, which is the actual stipulation and agreement, which was approved by the commission, that was negotiated and entered into prior to the, at least a portion, the summer of 2019. That agreement was entered into before the relevant audit period in this case. Is that correct?
I don't believe so. The audit period, as I understand it, included 2018 and 2019. And,
Oh, certainly.
and this would have been, so it would have been, I guess, partial.
Right. Okay. So it was entered into prior to the summer of 2019.
That's correct.
Okay. So I would like to turn your attention then and to page 3 of the stipulation and agreement.
Okay.
Okay. And in section, let me go back just a little bit here. Part of this prudency review, the audit period, deals with the number of demand response events, which Avergee called in the summer of 2019. Is that correct?
You're saying that part of the review, I'm sorry, can you repeat your question?
Sure. Pretty straightforward. I mean, part of the reason we're here today is it's a prudency review based upon staff's disagreement with the number of demand response events which were called by Avergee in the summer of 2019. Is that?
I don't know that I would characterize it that way. I think the recommended disallowances that I had aren't necessarily tied to a specific number of events called, but the lack of an attempt to maximize the benefits that are available from the program given the parameters of the program and the tariff.
Okay, but certainly the disallowances which you recommend to the commission are based upon additional demand response events being called by Avergee. Would that be accurate?
I would say that it would have been a better decision to call more events targeting areas that you could derive benefits from, yes.
Okay, so let's look at section 7 here, page 3 of this agreement. And specifically subsection B, and I'm going to read it. For the programmable thermostat program, the company will call 5 demand response events per jurisdiction during the summer of 2019, parentheses, June through September, and parentheses. Company will present data to the DSM advisory group following the 2019 season detailing the customer participation rates, example, opt-out percentage, participation duration, and parentheses, during each demand response events conducted in 2019. Did I read section 7B correctly there, Mr. Lupert?
I believe you read it correctly, yes.
Thank you, sir. And staff was a signatory to this agreement, is that correct?
Yes.
And this agreement was approved by the commission. Is that also correct?
Yes, it is.
Okay. And staff doesn't dispute whether or not Avergee abided by the terms of this agreement. Is that also correct?
Well, I guess I would say there was some confusion on the number of events, as I wrote in direct testimony. As from my recollection, Mr. File provided some more information in his testimony, stating that 5 events were called in 2019 and listed the dates.
Okay. But certainly, would it be fair to say that the issues presented in this case are not based upon staff's assertion that the company in any way violated this stipulation and agreement?
I don't think that the disallowances that I recommended are the result of that stipulation and agreement.
Great. Thank you, Mr. Rupert. Now, there's a fair amount of overlap here in issues between what we have in this MIA proceeding as well as the FAC proceeding, which occurred not too long ago. And I may refer back to your testimony there, Mr. Rupert. Do you have a transcript of the FAC proceeding?
I do, and I think it was broken into 2 different documents. So if you can direct me which one you're looking at.
Sure. I think most of your testimony is contained, if not all of it, in volume 2.
Okay, I have volume 2 open.
Excuse me, gentlemen, what case number are we talking about? I think for the record would be good for the FAC case that you're referencing.
Yeah. Let me try to find it here.
0262.
Yeah, if I may, it's EO-2020-0227.
Thank you, Mr. Keeble and Mr. Looper. So would it, in that proceeding, does it remain your position that the objective of the MIA programs is to decrease system peak load?
I don't know that that's the only objective of the MIA programs.
Okay. Would you be comfortable in believing that it's the primary objective?
I think, as I said in that case as well, I think it's an objective, and it's what Mr. File has stated as the primary objective of the demand response programs.
Well, I believe that he stated that it was the annual system peak load reduction, and then you countered that you believe that under the tariff that it was one of the objective was it was system peak load, which I think is a little bit different. Would you agree with that?
You're asking if I would agree that there's a difference between system peak load and annual peak load?
Yeah.
Yes, there can be a difference.
Okay, I'd like you, if we could turn to the transcript in the FAC proceeding, to volume 2, it's page 162, a line 9 through 20.
Mr. Hardin, what page number, please?
162.
And do you mind if I take a second to read this?
No. Yeah, absolutely. Just let me know when you're ready.
Okay.
Okay, so in response to a question, can you provide how quickly customers under this standard must recognize tangible financial benefits in your opinion? You responded, yeah, that's a good question. I'm glad you've asked. The issue that I've taken with these programs, specifically the demand response programs, is that they're only approved, or the measured lives are only for the period of time that the cycle is approved for. So in this case, for cycle 2, 2018 and 2019 is the only period, and that's the period that's subject to the MIA prudence review, is the only period that those programs are going to achieve demand reductions. And in this case, Avergee failed to derive those benefits for customers within that time period, and that's why I've recommended the disallowance. Did I accurately reflect your testimony there, Mr. Looper?
You read what is there. I think at the beginning you asked about some standard. If you could clarify that with your question, that'd be helpful.
Yeah, so yes, I believe that the standard I was referring to was the one that you had provided, which is that customers must receive tangible financial benefits.
I think that should certainly be a goal of any demand response program.
Sure. As a matter of fact, that's what you just reflected in the, I think that this is pretty consistent with what you just testified to with Mr. Hall's questioning, isn't it?
Yes.
Okay. Now, you probably don't have this in front of you, but subject to check. I'd like to read portions of regulation here on the definitions for demand-side programs and demand-side program investment mechanisms. It's the regulation 20 CSR 4240-20.092. Again, these are the definitions for the demand-side programs and demand-side programs investment mechanisms. And I'm looking at section 1C on avoided costs.
Okay.
And I'm looking at the last sentence of that definition of avoided costs. And it says, the utility shall use the integrated resource plan and risk analysis used in its most recently adopted preferred resource plan to calculate its avoided costs. Now, it would be correct to say that the purpose of this, the calculation of its avoided costs, is to determine whether or not the given MIA program is cost effective. Is that correct?
So what I would say is that the avoided costs used by the company are not the result of the integrated analysis or risk analysis that came out of their IRP. They were a proxy avoided cost that was calculated as the levelized cost of a hypothetical CT, and it doesn't reflect the first part of that rule, which states that it's the cost savings obtained by substituting demand-side programs for existing and new supply-side resources.
Okay, well, let's put aside whether or not, and that's somewhat new that you don't believe that the company utilized its IRP in determining what the avoided costs of these programs are. But let's kind of put that aside for just a second. Would you agree with me that under the regulation, the company was supposed to look at its IRP in determining what avoided costs are? for these programs.
So I think if I understand what you're asking is...
I can restate it.
Yeah, please do.
Okay, so was the company, pursuant to the regulation, supposed to utilize the integrated resource plan and risk analysis used in its most recent IRP to calculate its avoided costs?
Object. That's a purely legal question.
I'll allow it. It can go to wait.
So I think this may be repeating what I said before, but in my eyes, the proxy avoided costs used by the company was not an outcome of the analysis or the integrated resource analysis or the risk analysis in their IRP. It was just a calculation of the levelized cost of a combustion turbine.
Okay, so again, what I would like to do is let's for a second get away from what the company did or didn't do in terms of its calculation of avoided costs. Okay, what I would like to do is compare what your essentially your legal standard for this prudence review, or the time frame, versus what the regulation says. Now, you would agree with me that the IRP looks out over approximately a 20-year time frame. Is that accurate?
Yes.
Okay. Now, you have proffered that in order for a utility to prudently implement its MIA programs, that the appropriate time frame for them to do that is the period of time that the cycle is approved for. Is that accurate?
Specifically for these demand response programs or all programs?
Well, let's say the demand response programs, or the programs which are at issue in this particular case.
So I think there's a really fine line that needs to be kind of addressed, which is estimating the cost effectiveness through the EM&V process does not necessarily indicate that the programs were implemented prudently. And I think, a really similar thing to think about is for a traditional supply side resource, the company should always be seeking to maximize the revenues and minimize costs to the extent possible in order to lower fuel and purchase power costs expense, all else being equal. And that's kind of the point that I'm making here, is that the company knew of potential benefits that it could derive for ratepayers, and it failed to attempt to derive those benefits.
Do you think it would be better if that last sentence in 1C there on 092, if that were rewritten using the time period that you've provided to read, the utility shall use the period of time that the cycle is approved for to calculate its avoided cost?
I'm going to object to that. I think there's some confusion here regarding what this regulation applies to and what we're here today doing, because this regulation there's definitions for demand-side programs, investment mechanisms, whereas we're here today on the prudence review, which I believe is even pursuant to a separate rule. And I think we're mixing apples and oranges to a certain extent here. So I object to that basis.
Mr. Harden?
Well, sorry, I've got an echo. Give me 2 seconds here while I adjust. I think it gets to the key issue in this case, which is what time frame that the commission is supposed to be looking at to determine whether or not the company acted prudently. And we have a regulation here, which I would like the commission to take judicial notice of, which clearly states that in calculating the avoided costs, that the utility is supposed to look at its integrated resource plan, which looks out over a 20-year horizon. What we have here is testimony from staff saying that they believe that the company acted imprudently because it failed to implement the programs in a way where they were cost effective within what is essentially a 2-year time frame. So I don't think it's apples and oranges. I think it is. It has everything to do with the core issue in this case.
Judge, I politely raise my objection again. He is raising another legal argument, and at this point, he's arguing with the witness. That wasn't a question.
I was responding to Mr. Keevel's objection, which I was asked to do.
Judge, Mr. Keevel has a point that Mr. Harden is focusing on avoided costs, whereas I believe Mr. Lubert testifies to Avergee's failure to achieve customer benefit. I'm not sure that avoided costs are necessarily in and of themselves relevant to Mr. Lubert's testimony, and that's the point I'm making. Mr. Harden's making one argument about avoided costs. Mr. Lubert making a point about actual benefits to customers, which is not necessarily the same thing. So again, we have apples and oranges.
Okay. Mr. Harden, as I understood your question, you were asking Mr. Lubert's preference for what the legal standard should be. And I'm going to disallow that question. I do see that the discussion of 092C is relevant, but I also think you have made your point. I'm not sure how many questions you could have left.
Yeah, I agree with you. I agree with you, Your Honor, and the point has been made, and I don't want to belabor it further. So, Mr. Lubert, thank you for your patience and all of that. Let me ask you: do you continue to agree that historically capacity additions of supply side resources have tended to be lumpy? In other words, that they do not happen evenly across time, but some years there are lots of capacity additions and some years there's very little.
Yes.
Okay. Now, do you agree that when utility customers take advantage of a utility's demand side programs and adopt practices resulting in the use of less energy, that this produces avoided cost savings in the form of less wear and tear on the equipment used by the utility and lowered environmental costs?
I do not agree with that sentiment. Because of Avergee's participation in the SPPIM, the reductions from these demand response programs are unlikely to impact the amount that Avergee's supply side resources are dispatched. Given the relative size of the demand response programs to the relative size of the SPP market.
On page 8 of your rebuttal testimony, starting on line 6, you provide Avergee decisions makers have not fulfilled their responsibility to derive tangible financial benefits that mirror the claimed avoided capacity costs value. Did I read that correctly?
Mr. Harden, can you give me the page and line number?
Yes.
I'm sorry, I need the same.
Give me 2 seconds here.
I think you said page 8.
Line 6 of the rebuttal.
Did I say rebuttal?
Yes. And the direct doesn't have 8 pages.
Okay. Give me 2 seconds here. Sorry.
Oh, I think you might be referring to my rebuttal testimony in the FAC prudence case.
Is that right? Hold on just a second. Guys,
Mr. Harden, could you ask your question without
this is,
the need to
it's
use-
0227. You know what? And the problem is here, I had the wrong page number. Look on page 20. Again, I apologize. Yeah, it's the Avergee
Okay.
line 14.
Okay, give me just a moment, please.
Sure.
That's the one.
There you go. Yeah, I apologize.
Okay, I'm there.
Okay, so Avergee decision makers have not fulfilled their responsibility to derive tangible benefits that mirror the claimed avoided capacity cost values. Now, I just want to make sure that I understand your position, because that word mirror suggests that within that 2-year time frame, that it's your position that Avergee was supposed to get all of derived tangible benefits equal to all of the claimed avoided capacity costs within the 2-year time frame that you advocate for. Do I understand that correctly?
So I guess what this statement comes back to is that Avergee portrayed that there was potential customer benefits equal to the amount of the avoided costs that they put forward in front of the commission within their application for cycle 2. Following that, Avergee had the opportunity to derive these tangible financial benefits that I've estimated within the first 2 years, or within 2018 and 2019, from their demand response programs, and that it was imprudent for Avergee not to attempt to achieve those benefits.
Okay, but you don't mean, because that's an important point. So when you say mirror, you're not suggesting that within the 2-year time frame that Avergee was supposed to come up with all of the avoided costs that it, justified these programs for within that 2-year time frame, using only day-ahead L&P arbitraging and Schedule 11 fees from SPP.
I think Avergee should be attempting to maximize the benefits in each year regardless of what avoided costs they used for their application for approval.
Okay. Now, would you continue to agree, as you did in the FAC proceeding, that it is that the company did, through its implementation of the MIA program, that in fact there was some reduction in SPP Schedule 11 fees and a peak reduction for the day-ahead LMPs and Schedule 11?
I'm sorry, can you repeat your question?
Sure. As the company implemented its MIA programs, would you agree that in fact there was some reduction in the SPP Schedule 11 fees as well as a reduction in day-ahead LMP prices because of of how they implemented it?
From the implementation of the portfolio as a whole, yes, I would agree with that statement.
Thank you. Oh. I'm sorry. Did everybody hear me?
I did not hear you.
You're live now. Go ahead.
Oh, I'm sorry. Mr. Lupert, can you hear me now?
I can now, yes.
Okay.
I thought you had asked a question and I didn't hear it. Sorry.
Give me 2 seconds. Okay. Would you agree that calling of additional DR events could in fact affect customer behavior? For example, their inclination to override an event?
It may or it may not.
Okay, so based upon that answer, would you agree that it may or may not, by logical extension, calling additional DR events could affect customer behaviors in a manner that makes it more difficult for the company to reduce annual system-wide peak load?
I'm not sure that I've seen enough data to say that that is the case for Avergee's service area and
Sure.
for Avergee's customers. And part of the problem is a very small sample size, and to extrapolate anything from a sample size that small may not give the best result.
Sure, I understand that you haven't seen anything empirical to base it on, but by logical extension, you just said that it could affect customer behavior. If it could affect customer behavior, would you agree with me that it could then affect the company's ability to, when it does call DR events, to reduce annual system-wide peak load?
Well, I think this goes to a bit more broader of a point, which is in a circumstance contemplated by Avergee where you would need this resource to meet your resource adequacy needs for SPP, the likelihood of you only having to call one or 2 demand response events in a given year to mitigate even if your only goal is to mitigate the system annual peak, the likelihood of only needing to call 1 or 2 events to ensure that that's the case is pretty unlikely in my eyes. And to the extent that you have to ensure that that peak is mitigated, you would likely call multiple events in circumstances in which the company believes that a peak may occur. And then once that peak has been mitigated, there's going to be a second peak that could also be mitigated, and then a third peak. So to the extent that the thought is you should only test 2 events per year for the next 10 to 15 years in hopes that someday you'll be able to avoid an SPP resource adequacy fee is flawed in my opinion, because of the fact that when that does happen, you'll need to be able to call multiple events and understand what types of, I mean, I guess to your point, if there is a diminishing factor for calling multiple events, I would think that not only Avergee, but staff and the commission would want to know what type of, peak reductions could still occur if you have to call more than 2 to 3 events in a year.
Okay. On page 4 of your rebuttal testimony, in this case, and I'm going to read it and tell me if I get anything wrong. While this is on the issue.
Did you say rebuttal?
Actually, it's on it's your rebuttal.
There is no rebuttal.
Oh, shoot. Hold on. Sorry. It must be direct. Well, let me ask you if you agree with this. Your impact analysis was based upon historical data. Is that correct?
You're asking if my impact analysis that I based my recommended disallowances on is based on historical data?
Yes.
The impact analysis was, yes, whether the decision to not attempt to achieve those is not.
Right. Now, do you agree that the day-ahead L&P prices can be affected by entirely unforeseeable events unrelated to the weather, like transmission outages and that kind of thing?
Yes, they can be.
All right. And Mr. Lupert, do you have any experience in predicting either monthly or annual peak load?
No, I do not.
So going backwards just a little bit, to your impact analysis. Now, you've said that was based upon historical analysis, or I'm sorry, historical data. And you agree that the company would not have had that information at the time of the decision. And again, I'm confining this. I understand that your prudency analysis is ostensibly not based upon historical data, but I'm just talking about your impact estimate. You don't disagree that the company would not have had that data at the time the decision was being made, right?
They would have had some of the information.
Well, so for example, let me ask you just on the weather forecast, okay? You didn't go back to a given day in 2018 or 2019 to see what the forecast was for the next day and then verified whether that forecast was right. You didn't do anything along those lines, did you?
No, I did not.
Okay. And so is it safe to say that you identified the monthly peak loads in hindsight, and then you assumed that Avergee would have been successful in picking those days? Again, for your impact analysis.
Yes, I believe that's correct.
Okay. Now, you don't disagree, do you, that the capacity sales in SPP are bilateral in nature? Is that correct?
I agree.
Okay, I'm about to wrap up here, Mr. Lubert, but going back to the short-term, the tangible financial benefit sort of standard that you set out in your testimony. Do you know of any statute, rule, or commission order that sets forth that tangible financial benefit as the standard by which MIA programs or its management should be assessed or based?
I'm going to object to that as calling for a legal analysis.
Well, I'm asking him about his testimony. I did not come up, the company certainly did not come up with a tangible financial benefit. So I'm simply asking where that came from, if there's a legal basis for it, or quite honestly, any place that came up with tangible financial benefit. It is literally the crux of the case.
Mr. Keevil?
I'm not sure I understood the responses. That if he's looking for a legal analysis or not, Judge, but I suppose Mr. Lubert can say if he's aware of any statutes or regs that reference it, but beyond that, I'm not sure what the purpose of the question.
Thank you. Overruled. Go ahead, Mr. Harden.
Thank you. Mr. Lubert, do you know of any authority, statute, rule, commission, order that sets forth what you have deemed tangible financial benefits as the standard by which a MIA program or its management should be assessed or judged?
So I think a prudent decision maker would seek to maximize the potential benefits and reduce costs to the extent possible. And that's really what I'm talking about when I'm saying that Avergee had the responsibility to derive those tangible ratepayer benefits, but failed to do so, especially given the rate structure that they had in place and the incentive structure that they had in place, which would have required minimal additional costs with the potential to increase the potential benefits for ratepayers. But Avergee failed to do that within the prudence review period.
Okay, well, this is related, but it's also going back a little bit. It's in line with the weather question I asked you a little bit ago. Did the company have the LMP prices when it made the decision to call events?
Can you clarify which LMP prices?
Well, the ones in the future.
Well, depending on when a decision is made, the company could potentially have the day-ahead LMP prices to the extent that the company made the decision within the 24-hour period. The company would not have had real-time LMP prices at the time of deciding whether or not to call an event.
Mr. Looper, I appreciate your time this morning, and I've got no further questions. Oh, I would like to make sure, I would like to offer in as to evidence exhibit number 1, as well as exhibit number 2 that we discussed early on in the cross-examination. This is the stipulation and agreement regarding the extension of the MIA-2 programs into the summer of 2019, as well as the order approving the stipulation and agreement.
Thank you, Mr. Harden. Are there any objections to the admission of exhibits 1 and 2 into the hearing record? Hearing no objections, it is so admitted. We move on to commissioner questions, and I want to make sure that the commissioner's attendance is noted in the record for today, as it was yesterday. So I'll call roll call for commissioner questions. I saw Chairman Sylvie was in attendance. Chairman, do you have any questions?
No questions, Judge.
Thank you, Chair. And Commissioner Kinney, any questions? And Commissioner Roop?
No questions, Judge. Thank you.
Thank you, Commissioner. Commissioner Coleman, any questions? And Commissioner Holzman, any questions? Okay, I see the time as 10:11. Let's go ahead and jump into bench questions for Mr. Lubert. I'm looking at taking a break shortly to try and get us halfway to lunch and have a break. If anyone does need a break, please speak up. Mr. Lubert, you answered Mr. Harden's question about the tangible financial benefits authority by stating that your belief that a company should maximize benefits and minimize costs. Can you tell me where the maximize benefits and minimize costs authority came from?
So I think this goes back to what I was mentioning before with a traditional supply side resource. The company is tasked with maximizing its revenues from that resource and minimizing costs to the extent possible.
Yes, where are you reading that somewhere? You said the company is tasked with it. Who tasks them?
So I guess absent a fuel adjustment clause, the company is incentivized basically by increasing their revenues by keeping fuel costs low in a non-test year, or I guess outside of a rate case test year, because of the fact that rates would have been set at a given cost, and to the extent you can minimize that, you'd maximize the shareholder benefit. Now with an FAC, there's some sharing there, which obviously allows for the customers to pay for the fuel costs, fuel and purchase power costs, and there's a sharing percentage involved. But I think from past testimony that I recall, that the company has said that 5% sharing is enough of an incentive to make sure that they're keeping their fuel and purchase power costs as low as they can. And so this, my statement that they should be maximizing benefits at the lowest possible cost is based on what I would say a reasonable person would do if they were implementing the program.
Okay. So under a reasonable person standard, you're saying that they would obviously, a reasonable person would maximize and revenue minimize costs. Okay.
Right. If I could pay $100 and benefit myself $200, it would be imprudent for me to accept $120, right?
No, but I'm not the one answering questions. I understand your example, but I think some of those, there's other risks that we will probably have to put in there. Let me switch questions or thoughts, either or both. I asked a calculator question yesterday to calculate rates, and I wanted to explain that a little bit further. First, Mr. Lubert, did you bring a rate calculator with you, or did you already calculate these rates?
I did listen to your question yesterday, and I was hoping to get some clarification. So if you'd like to ask, I may have some follow-up clarification.
Excellent. What the commission wants to compare is to try and get their arms wrapped around a dollar-to-dollar comparison. And it's been very difficult because, as we've discovered, the setup to the program is based on estimates, and the end auditing is based on a review of accounting, but also with some of those savings based on those previous estimates. So to try and come up with a formula that might give us what Avergee's savings is. So we presumably know what Avergee's costs were for the DSIM program, and this is a proposed theory for how we could come up with a dollar number to show a benefit. So with that in mind, the highest electric rate was chosen. So out of Avergee Metros and Avergee West residential customers, there are several rate classes. That may not be the right word, but there are several rates within that. The highest is what is called residential customers without space heat. And since we're talking about summer months and we're talking about peaks, choosing the highest customer class cost and at the highest amount, so not just the customer in that class, but a customer in that class over 1,000 kilowatt hours, and taking that highest value residential customer savings number, I think, and comparing that. Did that help, Mr. Lubert?
So are you wanting to estimate what the benefits for the customer class is, or are you wanting the billed benefit for a specific customer?
For the class.
So the question is, I guess another clarification, are you asking about the entirety of the program portfolio in a given year? Or are you asking
Well, the
about
final-
a specific program?
The final question is, do you know the dollar value of the kilowatt hour savings for Avergee Metro residential customers at that rate? So I think if we take the peak kilowatt hours saved, so what was avoided, and that amount of electricity, kilowatt hours that was avoided, multiplied by the highest residential customer rate to equal out to a dollar amount. And
Okay.
let me check this email, see if I get clarification. We want to take the kilowatt hours savings from table 2 and multiply by this rate.
And
So we want to
are
take
you asking if that quantification would give you an estimate of the benefits to that customer class?
No, I'm just asking what the number is. And then the commissioners will draw the conclusion if that is an accurate representation of the savings.
Okay, I guess I need to clarify this, that any reduced kilowatt hour sales for the residential class, the company will be made whole through the use of the throughput disincentive for that reduced sales amount.
Okay, I still want the number. I'm looking at table 2, and I think if we take the first year gross annual energy savings deemed actual. So I believe the 121,323,629 number, and that's from table 2 of Avergee Metro's report.
Okay, if you give me just a moment,
Sure.
I will get there.
And what might be a good time now is to take a quick break to let Mr. Lubert do some calculations. Mr. Lubert, are you prepared to move forward with the calculations on your own for a few minutes?
I just want to clarify before we do break.
Yes.
You said page 7, is that correct? Or page 5?
Page 5, table 2. It was the table that I had all the questions about yesterday. And
okay, and you're wanting to, sorry, go ahead.
First year gross annual energy savings deemed actual. So the $121,323,629 amount in Avergee Metro's table 2.
Okay. And you want that multiplied by the highest
The
rate
highest residential
and base
customer
rate, which is the 0.14916
yes.
per kWh. Is that correct?
Yes.
And are you asking what that product will mean, or are you just wanting to? No. You're just wanting me to calculate what that number times the other number would equal?
Yes. Both for Avergee Metro and for Avergee West.
Okay.
All right. Then we will take a short restroom break. We will come back at 10:35. 10:35. We are in intermission, everyone. Thank you.
Thanks.
Just a couple minutes left, everyone. Just an announcement, couple minutes left. Let's go back on the record. Intermission having concluded. We were in the middle of bench questions for Mr. Lubert, and Mr. Lubert was calculating a couple of theoretical rate amounts. Mr. Lubert, are you still there? You're currently muted, by the way.
I apologize. At some point, I will get the hang of this double mute, and at which point we'll probably be back in person.
Hey, not a problem. I had to postpone an entire hearing yesterday, so I got you beat. Go. Did you were you able to calculate the two numbers I asked for?
Yes, I was.
Thank you, and I do apologize. I'm not trying to make you do my homework. I realize I could have multiplied those together, but I am mindful that we want that in the record for the commissioners to be able to put in their decision. Can you go ahead and give me those numbers?
Okay, so I just want to clarify, make sure I'm giving you what you're asking for. You're wanting the first year gross annual energy savings deemed actual in Table 2, and that's for the entire portfolio for the company, both residential and business. And you're wanting me to multiply that by the highest rate for non-space heat customers over 1,000 kWh from, let's see, I want to make sure I get the tariffs right too. For Metro, sheet number 5A, and that's the 10th revised sheet number 5A. And for West,
Yes.
It would be the first revised sheet number 146.1. Is that correct?
Yes.
Okay. Those two numbers multiplied together for Metro, I have 121,323,629 multiplied by 0.14916 equals 18,096,632.50.
Thank you.
That's for Metro.
Could you repeat that? 18,096,000.
$632.50. And are you ready for me to move on to West?
Yes, go ahead.
Missouri West? Okay, so again, on this calculation, what I'm looking at is the West report, Table 2, first year gross annual energy savings, deemed actual for the entire portfolio as $121,933,329. And I'm multiplying that by the rate for over 1,000 kWh for non-space heating customers on sheet 146.1 as 0.11927, and multiplying those two numbers together comes up with $14,542,988.15.
Thank you, Mr. Lubert. And could you tell me why the TRC test is not equivalent to a prudence finding?
Sure. So what the TRC test is looking at, and actually, if you'll give me a moment, I'll pull up the definition of the TRC from Chapter 20. It says it's a test that compares the sum of avoided utility costs, including avoided probable environmental costs, to the sum of all incremental costs of end-use measures that are implemented due to the program, including both utility and participant contributions, plus utility costs to administer, deliver, and evaluate each demand-side program and costs of statewide TRM or TRM and statewide TRM. So within that definition of the TRC, it's a comparison of avoided utility costs. And as I've brought up in other dockets, the assumed value that Avergee has used and continued to provide its EM&B contractor is an inflated value that doesn't reflect actual utility costs that will be avoided. To go a bit further, in my eyes, in order for the demand response program to be truly cost effective, the actual realized ratepayer benefits of that program needs to outweigh the costs associated with the implementation of that program. And I mentioned before that, you know, the effect of any demand reductions from the demand response incentive program ended with the end of the event season in 2019. And so there will be no further demand reductions that are the results of the implementation of that program. The other part of my answer to your question is that just because a program is deemed cost effective through the EM&B process, it doesn't demonstrate that the company implemented the program prudently. Basing that cost effectiveness on that hypothetical cost that will likely never be realized by ratepayers doesn't alleviate the obligation for Avergee to implement the programs in the most cost-effective manner possible. In my eyes, that would be implementing them in a way that maximizes the actual ratepayer benefits, which, all else being equal, would result in a bill reduction. Just because the commission approved the program based on what was portrayed as the avoided capacity costs doesn't mean that the program is automatically prudent in its implementation. I think the company could implement its approved program within the confines of the approved tariffs, the approved budgets, the proposed program structure, while still being deemed cost-effective through EM&B, and still have implemented the programs in an imprudent manner, which is what I've brought today.
Okay, thank you. I don't see any other questions from me. So we will return to re-cross-examination. We'll start first with Avergee. We'll back out of this.
Thank you, Your Honor. Can we have just a second?
Yes.
We want you to clarify.
Thank you, Your Honor. Just very quickly, Mr. Looper, we just wanted to clarify, make sure that we were on the same page on this table 2 on the deemed actual first year gross annual energy savings at 121,323,629, which you then calculated to a rate basis. Now those are savings annually, right? So every year that is that's the savings amount. Would you agree with that? That's not a one-time number. That's an annual number of savings.
It is the first year annual savings for the measures implemented for the portfolio as a whole.
May I interrupt? Mr. Harden, I apologize. Yes. Mr. Lubert, we had quite a conversation with Mr. Fortson yesterday trying to square that away. I thought that we landed on, even though it says first year and annual, that it's really talking about the 21-month period that is the title of Table 2. April 1, 2018 through December 31st, 2019. So I just want to point that out because you just, in your answer, seem to depend on the words first year.
So I apologize for any confusion here. I think what is in that table, and the reason I'm saying I apologize is because I was not involved in the creation of that table. But I believe the contents of that table are the sum of the first year annual energy savings over the 21-month review period for the entire portfolio. And that may be something that Mr. Fortson could clarify. I'm sure he's still available.
Okay, Mr. Harden, go ahead, and I will count on Mr. Keevil to be talking to Mr. Fortson in the background. Go ahead.
Yeah, thank you. And I just want to make sure that I understand your answer one way or the other, Jay. But are you saying that number is the savings for not just the first year, but for the consecutive years thereafter for the programs?
That number would not be the same in each year following because of differences in measure lives, which would vary by measure and program, and whether or not it was residential or commercial.
Okay, it would not be this, it wouldn't be the same, but all right, appreciate it. Thank you for the clarification.
Mr. Harden, are you done with your cross?
Oh, I'm sorry. Yes, I am. I have
All
nothing
right.
further.
And let's go to Mr. Hall.
Thank you, Judge. Mr. Looper, could you turn back to the table 2? It doesn't matter which version of the report, but the table 2 that the judge had you look at when finding the variables to put in the formula he asked you to do. Mr. Looper, can you hear me?
I apologize. Is that better?
Yes. Did you hear my question?
Okay. I did. I'm looking at the West report. I can pull up Metro if that's your preference.
It doesn't matter, because the reason
Okay.
why I'm asking you to bring this up is to ask you, these tables in both reports, these are cumulative totals for the entire Avergee portfolio for both companies, correct?
I think the table is company specific, but yes, it's the entire portfolio.
And so it's not isolating or looking at the thermostat demand response programs.
No, and it's not isolating residential programs either. This includes everything from the commercial industrial custom program to, the business standard, as well as all of the residential programs.
And and by that same logic, it's also not focusing on the demand response incentive programs either.
I would say the demand response incentive program has no impact whatsoever on the deemed actual first year gross annual energy savings number.
Why is that?
Because the demand response incentive program does not, there is no calculated kWh savings from that program to my knowledge.
So this, I will look at the West report since that's what you're at. If I can find it. So this $120 million figure, that is all of the programs in the portfolio, and that number is it's hiding whatever savings may or may not have been achieved through the thermostat programs.
So just to clarify, you mentioned $120 million value. This would be 120 million kilowatt hours. So just with that clarification, yes, this doesn't, it's not broken out by program, and it I guess to what I said earlier, it includes everything in the portfolio.
So Mr. Looper, taking the formula at face value, multiplying the kilowatt hour savings times a base rate in customer bills, would that formula demonstrate any savings or benefits for customers who do not participate in energy efficiency programs?
No, it wouldn't be a good estimation of that. And I'll say, first and foremost, using the highest residential rate and applying that to kilowatt hours saved from the portfolio as a whole is pretty misleading as far as what that number would actually provide. The other thing that I think really needs to be pointed out is those kilowatt hour savings. Avergee's made whole through the throughput disincentive for that lost revenue. And so essentially what that boils down to is a participating customer may see a slight bill reduction based on their kilowatt hour savings, but that revenue difference is then made up by the class as a whole. So even if this was broken down to just say residential customers savings, and you're multiplying that by that highest rate, it still wouldn't be a good estimate of the customer benefit.
Let's extrapolate on that. I want to take like a really aerial view of this and let's take let's look at the Avergee timeline as example. Is it your understanding that Avergee's base rates were last set in 2018?
That is my understanding, yes.
So that's what set these base rates, and that includes investment, O&M going forward for the company.
It would have been based on the test year.
Avergee cycle 2. Since cycle 2, Avergee applied for a third cycle of MEA programs, correct?
That's correct.
When was that approved?
I can give you the exact date. I believe it was, I'm sorry, what did you say?
Sorry, the exact date's not necessary. I'm just looking for a broad timeline here.
I believe it was late 2019 was the original report and order. And that was followed up with an amended report and order a couple months after that.
And as we've all been discussing over the past 2 days, in a MEA application, there are the proponents of these energy efficiency programs are going to provide X amount of savings, and they're going to have X proxy costs applied to the savings to claim benefits, correct?
Yes, and Avergee has an incentive to elevate the estimated capacity savings in order to boost the cost effectiveness of all of their programs. And this isn't necessarily the venue that I've argued this, but I've argued in others that their estimated avoided costs were unrealistic.
Explain what you mean by incentive.
Well, I'd like to lodge a bit of an objection here. That I think that we're pretty much well beyond the scope of the bench's questions on this, which, as I understand, we are in redirect.
I do need some leeway to explain, but this does direct to your questions. If given an opportunity, I will rephrase my question to try to get this more narrow.
Overruled, I'll allow it. Go ahead, Mr. Hall.
Mr. Looper, when any electric utility company is going to come in for a rate case, they're going to supply numbers for their investments in the test year going forward to set base rates and to set rates in the future, correct?
Yes.
Has Avergee come in for a rate case since their last rate case in 2018?
They have not filed for a general rate case since their last proceeding.
Based on your personal understanding and knowledge, do you believe Avergee will be including more investments in its next rate case relative to the 2018 case?
Mr. Hall, can you explain to me how that's related to Cycle 2 prudence review?
Without what I'm trying to get to, Judge, is that the judge has asked Mr. Lubert for this formula to derive certain benefits that can be attributed to Cycle 2. Mr. Lubert has already testified there were no avoided costs in Cycle 2. If there are no avoided costs, then we should see more investments going forward in the next rate case, meaning that bills will go up, and that any of these quote unquote savings from Lubert's formula do not readily demonstrate that customers actually saved any money going forward.
When you reference Lubert's formula, are you referencing the calculation that I asked him to perform?
Yes, Your Honor.
That's not his, that came from the commission.
I
It seems
understand.
pretty speculative, Mr. Hall, is what I'm getting at.
Fair enough, Your Honor. I will redirect my questions and get more narrow at this time.
Okay, go ahead.
Mr. Lubert, do you recall the conversation I had with you earlier about Avergee's avoided costs from cycle 2?
I do.
And do you agree with me that avoided costs represent the deferral of future investments?
I think avoided costs should most accurately reflect potential costs that can realistically be expected to be avoided through the implementation of a program. I don't know that we've seen that in either cycle application yet.
If an electric utility does not avoid costs through its energy efficiency programs, generally then we should see more supply side investments going forward.
Your Honor, again, this is beyond the scope of what the bench asked.
It's fully
Mr. Hall, do you have
Mr. Luber.
Mr. Hall,
Yes, Your Honor.
do you have a response to the objection?
Yes, it's fully within the scope because this formula is from the context of the question. I think it's getting to some type of purported benefit. And what I'm trying to establish with Mr. Lubert is that there are no actual benefits as represented from that formula.
Okay, but I don't know how you're connecting your argument that there are no benefits to a future rate case or even a present ongoing rate case.
I apologize for any lack of clarity on my part. Let me, if you may, I will try again with a different question to Mr. Lubert.
Okay, I'll allow one more question. Let's see if we can get there though.
Mr. Lubert, with all due respect to the question offered from the commission, do you believe this formula accurately represents benefits that Avergee's customers are receiving from these demand side programs?
No, I do not.
Why not?
Well, I think I pointed out some of the flaws in the estimation and the fact that you're using not only you're summarizing or you're generalizing that you'd be using the highest residential rate and then multiplying that by kilowatt hour savings for the portfolio as a whole, when generally speaking, the residential energy rate will be higher than some other classes. That poses a problem. And then the presence of the throughput disincentive, wherein the company is made whole for any potential lost revenues, means that the rate class as a whole may not be, they may not have that savings because it'll be recovered through the DSIM.
Thank you. Mr. Luber, did you have something else to add?
No, sorry.
Oh, I must have heard feedback. Thank you. I have no further questions.
Thank you, Mr. Hall, and redirect from Mr. Keevil.
Yes, Judge, thank you. Mr. Luber, let me see if I can put a finer point perhaps on what Mr. Hall was asking you. does the calculation, or do the calculations which you performed pursuant to the judge's request, do those calculations represent savings for the customer class, and I get for any customer class, for the period under review?
No.
Does it represent anything specific that you are aware of?
I don't think that the estimation provides a useful look at the effectiveness of the portfolio or any program specifically.
Okay. Would you agree, and this goes back to when the judge said, the judge referenced something that Mr. Fortson had said on the stand yesterday. Would you, regarding what the amounts in Table 2 represent, and I believe, which figure was it from Table 2 that you used, sir, in the calculation that the judge asked you to perform? Not the
That would be
the descriptive.
Yes, that was first year gross annual energy savings, KWH, deemed actual.
Okay. Now, would you agree, sir, that that amount is a cumulative amount for the review period of April 1st, 2018 through December 31st, 2019?
I believe that's correct.
Mr. Harden asked you some questions about your testimony where you refer to tangible financial benefits, and Mr. Harden referred to your description of that as a standard for evaluating MIA programs. And I don't remember whether it was Mr. Harden or the judge, but one of them asked you if you were aware of any statutes or regulations regarding MIA where that standard was set forth. Do you recall that line of questioning, sir?
I do.
I believe your answer was you weren't aware of any statute or regulation which included that term. Was that basically your answer?
I think that was part of my answer, and I think I also expanded that doesn't necessarily mean, or I guess that was part of my answer, yes.
And would you agree, though, sir, that your use of the term is related more to the reasonable person standard of the prudence review?
Yes.
And as such, it is really based on just general concepts of rate making rather than specific statutory language?
Yes.
Mr. Harden also asked you, I believe he referred to it as your impact analysis, and he referred to it as being based on historical information. When you were answering those questions, sir, what did you understand the term, as Mr. Harden was using it, of impact analysis to mean?
So the way I understood the question was, I guess, first and foremost, when I was reviewing the program period, the first question that comes to mind is, did the utility make imprudent decisions by not trying to attempt to achieve benefits? And the answer to that question was yes, they did not attempt to achieve those benefits despite recognizing that there was the potential for those benefits. Then the next, kind of thought process was, well, did they have the opportunity to attempt that without incurring additional substantial cost? And the answer to that question, again, is yes, they could have attempted to call more events and target events that wouldn't have increased program costs substantially. So at that point, within the kind of the reasonableness standard, you have to go back and you have to look at what impact that imprudent decision made on customers. And so given the fact that the prudence review occurs after the implementation period, I went back and I looked at historical data to try to estimate what the impact was of that imprudent decision in the first place. And that basically by default has to look at some historical data.
Did you employ a hindsight analysis, as Mr. Harden suggested you did?
No, I did not.
Can you
explain? It was an impact
that?
analysis. It was an impact analysis of the imprudent decision in the first place. So if you know that you can save if you know you can save ratepayers money and it's not going to increase program costs substantially, you should do so because a reasonable person would do so. The impact, it will always use some historical data to understand what the actual impact was. But it is not a hindsight analysis.
Mr. Harden also asked you some questions about avoided costs and referred to the Commission's regulation. Do avoided costs, or does the term avoided costs equal benefits to customers?
Not always. If avoided costs are accurate, it can equal customer benefits. What I've laid out in this case and other cases is that the estimated avoided costs put forth by Avergee are inflated and don't reflect what the customers may actually see. And all of that is to really say that the avoided costs may be used through the EM&V process to come up with a cost effectiveness score or a TRC number. But even if that number is above 1, that doesn't mean that the program was implemented prudently. If there is an opportunity to save ratepayers money at a minimal cost, Avergee they're obligated to do so, and they haven't.
Would you also agree, sir, then that cost effectiveness analysis through the EM&V process does not demonstrate that the company implemented a program prudently?
No, it does not demonstrate that.
What does it demonstrate?
The EM&V process verifies, to the extent possible, actual kilowatt hour savings and kilowatt savings from programs. Then, at least historically, what has been done is the EM&V evaluator will multiply those savings by an avoided energy cost and avoided capacity cost that's provided by the company. Now, what gets really important if you're looking at comparing, I'm going to say, quote unquote, benefits to the costs, is whether or not you're looking at avoided costs that are actually incurred or are reasonably incurred, or if you're looking at a proxy number that is a hypothetical and unlikely to be incurred. And I would guess, in my eyes, the EM&V process thus far has utilized those proxy avoided costs that are unrealistically expected or unlikely to be incurred, and therefore the customer benefit gets diminished.
All right. Mr. Harden also referred you to, I forget whether it was Exhibit 1 or Exhibit 2, but it was a stipulation from a prior case that referred to the company calling 5 events during 2019. Do you remember that, sir?
I do.
Do you happen to have a copy of that stipulation handy?
I do.
Now, is your recommendation contrary to the provision there in paragraph 7 of the stipulation?
I don't believe it is.
Why not?
I would view that the 5 demand response events as a minimum. And I certainly think that Avergee could have called more than 5 events. And regardless of what is within this stipulation for 2019, nothing was in effect in 2018 that precluded Avergee to call up to or at the maximum number of events to derive as much benefit as they could. So despite their argument that they felt this number was a cap, which I struggle to understand, there was no such perceived cap in 2018, and yet they called a minimum amount of events.
In fact, they called, I believe, 2 in 2018, was it?
It sounds correct. And I guess just to expand on that a bit, as we were reviewing kind of the Cycle 3 application, it became evident that the number of events being called each year was trending, it was decreasing. The company was calling fewer and fewer events. So this, what I would say is a minimum, was something that we pushed for as far as being included in the extension agreement, because of the fact that fewer and fewer events were being called.
Okay, excuse me. There's been a lot of discussion both yesterday and today about, excuse me, calling events. And I want to get away from that, I think, for just a moment here, or see if there's a distinction. As I understand your proposal regarding the thermostats, the programmable thermostat, your recommended disallowance is not based entirely on whether or not Avergee called the proper number of events as it concerns the thermostats. Is that correct?
Absolutely correct.
What is the basis for your recommendation regarding the thermostats?
If you'll give me a moment, there were several issues that I raised with the thermostat program specifically. And as a kind of a high level, one of the issues was the fact that Avergee gave away quite a few thermostats, and I'm not going to differentiate between West and Metro, but Avergee as a whole gave away quite a few thermostats that were never ultimately enrolled in the demand response program, despite the fact that the tariff says that customers' air conditionings will be cycled as part of that tariff. So essentially, they gave away thermostats that were useless from a demand response standpoint, which we're not talking about cheap thermostats. So they're not the traditional cheap thermostat you're going to put on a wall. So that was a decent sized cost that I recommended a disallowance for. Another one of the issues that I raised was the fact that Avergee hit its target for the program cycle as a whole for thermostats in 2017, and then decided to use the most expensive way possible to throttle additional adoption of the thermostats, which was utilizing direct installation of thermostats. And for kind of an explanation of what that means is, instead of allowing a bring your own thermostat customer to install their own thermostat and reimburse just for the cost of the thermostat, the direct install method not only pays in full for the thermostat, but also pays in full for professional installation of that thermostat. And I personally have installed a smart thermostat. They're not very difficult. They're fairly easy to do. And I think you could see that if you looked at the uptick in bring your own thermostats that occurred in 2019 once the company got its extension approved. So basically what they were doing is they were limiting how many people could install thermostats by making it the program as expensive as possible in 2018. So that was another issue that I raised as far as the residential thermostat programs are concerned.
And neither of those concerns have anything to do with the number of events called. Is that correct?
No, they do not.
I believe in response to some questions from Mr. Hall, you were referring to, or you said something about when the cycle, like cycle 1, cycle 2 that we're dealing with here today, cycle 2, when the cycle is over, benefits from demand response MIA programs end. Is that correct?
Yes, and essentially what I'm saying there is that Avergee will not continue to see demand reductions from that demand response program after the cycle is over, unless they re-enroll those customers and pay them again, and then recover that cost from ratepayers through the DSIM again. So the demand reductions stop as soon as the cycle is over.
If you give me just a moment here, Judge.
Yes, go ahead.
Quick question here, Mr. Luber. The judge asked you, I believe it was, why is the TRC test not equivalent to a prudence finding? Are there other cost effectiveness tests for to determine cost effectiveness of a energy efficiency program, or for a demand response program more specifically?
There are. I think what's really important to keep in mind when you're looking at the cost effectiveness test is they rely so heavily on the need for the assumed avoided costs to be realistically assumed to be able to actually avoid a utility cost. To the extent that they don't, the cost effectiveness tests, the efficacy of them is diminished.
I think that's all the questions I have, Judge. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Keevil. And I believe, Mr. Lubert, you are excused. We will move on to our next witness, and that is Dr. Jeff Mark. Dr. Mark, if you would speak up so I can swear you in.
I'm here, Judge.
Ah, there you are. Do you solemnly swear or affirm that the testimony you give in this hearing will be the truth?
I do.
Thank you. And Mr. Hall, your witness.
Thank you. Dr. Mark, good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
By whom are you employed and in what capacity?
The Missouri Office of Public Counsel. I'm the chief economist.
And on whose behalf are you testifying today?
Missouri Office of Public Counsel.
Dr. Mark, are you the same Jeff Mark who caused to be filed rebuttal testimony in this case?
I am.
And the same accompanying rebuttal testimony, was that also your product?
Yes.
Did you also prepare an errata sheet for any corrections that you had for your testimony?
I did.
If I asked you the questions contained in the your rebuttal testimony, incorporating the corrections from your errata sheet, would your answers be same or substantially similar?
They'd be the same.
And then is your rebuttal testimony correct and true? Pardon me, let me rephrase that. Is your rebuttal testimony with the corrections from your errata sheet true and correct as to the best of your belief?
Yes.
Same question, but as to your rebuttal testimony.
Yes.
Your Honor, at this time, I would offer into evidence Exhibits 200, 201, and 202, the rebuttal testimony of Dr. Jeff Marks, rebuttal testimony, and errata sheet, respectively.
Thank you, Mr. Hall. Are there any objections to the admission of the three exhibits, the rebuttal, the rebuttal, and the errata sheet, exhibits 200, 201, and 202?
All right, Judge, I don't have an objection. This is Mr. Keeble. No objection, but I don't remember, when was the errata sheet submitted?
It was
not sure I have a copy of that.
Mr. Keeble, I believe I emailed it out to all parties the day before the hearing. I can resend it to you at this time.
Okay, I appreciate that. And the errata is 202, Mark's exhibit number 202?
Yes.
Okay, thanks very much.
Okay, and Mr. Hall, have you tendered the witness?
I have not, Your Honor, pardon the delay.
Sorry, go ahead, Lisa.
I'm sorry. Did you receive those then?
Yes, I sure did.
Okay, sorry about that. Go ahead.
That's not a problem.
I had not yet tendered the witness. I was sending the errata sheet to Mr. Keeble. At this time, I tender the witness for cross.
Thank you, sir. And we go to Mr. Keeble for cross.
I have no questions, Judge.
Thank you, sir. We'll go to Avergee.
Thank you, Judge. I had no questions either.
Thank you, Mr. Fisher. Commissioner questions. Thank you. And bench questions. I do have a couple. Dr. Mark, help me understand a 50-50 ratio for incentive to non-incentive spending.
Sure.
Would not be considered imprudent. Is that correct?
Correct.
And your testimony highlighted, and I'm going to mix up the numbers, I apologize, but Metro and West had administrative costs of 55 and 60% was the high. I've also seen 59% and 55%.
Right. And if I may, I can clarify why there's a difference. The 60% represents 2018 as reported in the EIA data. The 59 represents the fact that we're extending beyond just the 2018 year.
Okay. My question is, why is 50% acceptable and 55% imprudent?
Right. So my rebuttal testimony articulated some baseline numbers across the nation according to EIA, and that's on page 4, figure 2. The 38% was the national average for non-incentive spending. I use that as an acceptable baseline of averages, and understanding that average encompasses small, big utilities and everything in between, 500 plus utilities across the nation. I then looked at the historical spending of each of the investor-owned utilities per EIA's 861 data. And those are on page 5 and 6. And what you'll notice there is that these numbers are effectively, they fluctuate year over year, but each one of these numbers is below 50% as a general rule until we get to 2018. And there's reasons for that. And the rest of my testimony articulated, why those costs are higher for Avergee and why I'm asking that 50% be used as a threshold. The 50%, as opposed to saying 60% or 55%, is acknowledging in part that some of that overhead cost is part of the ability just to go ahead and operate these programs. So the EM&V, the management, at the end of the day, the 50% was an appropriate benchmark to go ahead, from our perspective, to send to the company that we're not going to sit there and say that you should benchmark absolutely at 38% or whatever the EIA is saying, but clearly anything above spending more than half of your energy efficiency budget on non-energy efficiency measures is problematic. The extreme would have been to add on a couple more $1 million to go up to 60%, and then say we're going to hold them to the U.S. standard of 38 for 2018. I felt like we're trying to be reasonable here because, Judge, at the end of the day, my goal is for this company to do better, for ratepayers to achieve something more out of these programs in terms of the money that's going into it. So really, the goal here, in signaling the mismatch between administrative spending and actual energy efficiency spending is predicated on we want this company to do better moving forward.
Would 51% be imprudent?
Moving forward or for this case?
Either.
My hope is that if by the commission acknowledging that 50% as a one-time shot here, that would set a precedent and the company would be more conscious of that moving forward. And that they would, if I can't speak to how our office would respond to a 51% in the future or not at this point. It would be speculative on my part. It would be frowned upon at the end of the day.
Is there it seems like we are either prudent or imprudent. Is there a middle ground where the company should get a warning and say, hey, we need to back off a little, or change these numbers before it becomes imprudent? Or is it at 51, we're automatically deemed imprudent?
Yeah, that's a great question. And there's a lot of nuances that's involved in MIA. No doubt we've discussed a number of them. Let me try to give an illustrative example. We've been throwing the term cost effective around quite a bit in today. And my testimony took issue with the term cost effectiveness, and that's largely an EM&V issue, or it's I'll take that back. It's not even really an EM&V issue. It's a market potential issue. It's on the front end. So when we're looking at those programs, is it cost effective based off of the assumed avoided cost at this moment moving forward? And we're projecting that out over the next 4 years. The EM&V and prudence are looking at two distinct different things. And that's why they're separate cases. Mr. Hardin introduced, I think it was Exhibit 2, and he introduced an EM&V study. And that study is actually a really good illustrative example of what I mean and why cost effectiveness shouldn't be, we should be careful when we throw that term around, and then how that plays into your exact question as to, is it imprudent or prudent? On page 32, that actually has a breakdown of the different cost effective ratios in that exhibit. And you'll note that in 2018, the residential thermostat program had a 0.34. That's under 1, and that suggests that program's not cost effective. If we were to operate under, a hard, fast 1, that if it's, below this threshold, then we would say, oh, this is imprudent, and for the various reasons that we need to find out. Interestingly, what you see here in 2019 is that the number goes up. So you have to ask yourself, well, what was different about 2018 versus 2019? I would offer up, look at the EIA data. The big difference, if you look at my page 6 of my rebuttal testimony, every year of Avergee's programs, we're talking, well, below 40%, I guess with the exception of the 2013 year, but the programs were only at, what, $7 million on Avergee West. My point is that all of a sudden you see that spike in non-administrative cost in 2018. That corresponds again, and it's not solely because although I take issue with the thermostats, I'm taking issue with the entire portfolio of administrative costs that Avergee is putting forward. So that assumes a lot of things, and it gives the company an enormous amount of discretion as to how they spend their dollars. So if I'm going to contract out to a third party for O-Power to do behavioral response programs, those are actual mailers that go into customers, I'm paying a premium dollar as opposed to doing that in-house, which is what
Judge, I think at this point, I'd like to interject an objection. I think Dr. Mark is going way beyond the question from the bench and has wandered off into areas that I don't think is relevant at all.
Judge, if I may, I'll try to clean it up.
Judge, I'd like to hear a response from Public Counsel.
I would offer that since it was the judge's question, the judge has not objected or asked the witness to narrow the response, that an objection to a witness offering the response is not proper unless the judge wants Dr. Mark to rephrase his response or otherwise narrow it.
I'm going to sustain the objection. Dr. Mark, I got the answer you were going for. Thank you, sir.
Okay.
Do you think OPC and staff have any responsibility for their approvals along the way, such that you even had to come in and have a stipulation saying, call this many events? Do you think that staff and OPC should have realized that perhaps Avergee was a little reluctant and needed a more structured system?
It's a fair question, Judge. I guess this is what I struggle with, is that, and my testimony talks about it. At this point, we're talking about 70,000 plus thermostats that are out there in their overall service territory. And we're even today, right now, we're continuing to give away thermostats, very heavily incentive, lots of dollars. And this is an unused asset that's out there. To the extent that we've got a responsibility to point that out, I believe we have. This is sort of the last straw in terms of making this an issue, is actually taking it in front of the commission. But we do meet on a quarterly basis. We do provide input. But ultimately, at the end of the day, this is a managerial decision. I mean, this is the company's decision to either execute and utilize these assets or not. From my perspective, I try to go out of my way, not to be accused of Monday morning quarterbacking and giving fair notice that this is an issue for us. Unfortunately, this is where we're at.
Okay. I believe That is all the questions I have, Dr. Mark. Thank you. Let's
Thank
go
you.
to recross. That takes us to staff. Mr. Keevil.
Very briefly, Judge, Dr. Mark, you referred to an exhibit that Mr. Harden used at some point yesterday, but I believe Exhibit 1 and 2 were his stipulation and his order approving stipulation. Those aren't the exhibits you were referring to, were they, sir?
I received a copy it was CC'd on an email for an exhibit that included a document. My understanding is that it was Exhibit 2, the Evergreen Economics. I could be wrong.
Okay, I'm sorry, you were referring to the EM&V study by Evergreen when you were referring to this exhibit from Mr. Harden.
That's correct.
Okay, so whatever number that was, Judge, do you have a number for that one?
Judge, I'm not sure that was ever introduced.
No, it was not ever introduced. And it wasn't utilized.
Okay.
Testimony.
Okay. So it wasn't marked for identification?
Right.
Okay. Okay.
Or offered.
Okay. Nothing further then, Judge. Thanks.
That takes us to recross from Avergee.
Thank you, Judge. Dr. Mark, you were asked some questions about your 50-50 split of incentive costs to non-incentive costs by the judge. Do you recall that?
I do.
Is there any PSC rule that establishes a 50-50 split as the appropriate red line between prudence and non-prudence?
Objection, legal question.
I'm going to overrule that. We've been allowing that throughout this hearing. It'll go to wait. I understand that Dr. Mark is not a lawyer.
Would you like to answer that, Dr. Mark?
As far as, and to understand the question, just to rephrase it, correct me if I'm wrong. Do I know of any precedent or PSC, I got a PSC ruling that says 50-50 is the prudent standard?
Yes.
I'm not aware of a specific ratio. I'm aware of any ratio necessarily for a prudency standard.
That's just one you've created for this case?
Based off of my expertise.
You were asked, I think you answered some questions on, you mentioned the 38% national average, and that was acceptable to you? Is that right?
That's correct.
Do you agree that utilities may characterize incentive and non-incentive costs somewhat differently depending on where they're at?
I can agree with that.
So not every utility in the country characterizes incentives and non-incentive costs exactly the same?
There's a lot of nuances within that, yes.
Did you research the Missouri MIA rules for a definition of incentive and non-incentive costs?
The MIA rules?
Yes.
Not in preparing this testimony.
Do you know if the Missouri PSC MIA rules define incentive and non-incentive costs in any way?
I can't speak to that offhand.
So you don't know, or you haven't researched it?
Ed, I mean, being put on the spot here, I couldn't recite verbatim what the codified rules say. If you could refer them to me.
Well, I'm asking if you know whether they exist.
Well, I know this. I know that the individual cost-effective tests articulate specific inputs that go into that, and reasonable minds can differ as to whether or not you're.
My question, Dr. Mark, is there a definition that you're aware of in the Missouri MIA rules that define incentive and non-incentive costs?
I'm not Again, I couldn't, I'm not aware of it.
Did you try to find a definition?
Did I try to find a definition of incentive? I did not. Not for the Missouri rules.
Did you include in your testimony how the Form EIA-861 defines incentive and non-incentive costs?
Non-incentive as administrative, marketing, or other, and incentive as energy efficiency incentive spending.
Did you include in your testimony how the form defines incentive and non-incentive costs?
I put down the figure taken from the EIA website.
Did that include a specific definition of what is included in incentive and in non-incentive costs?
Other than what's in that figure, sir.
So there's no definition of what's included. You just have the numbers, correct?
So that's correct.
Did you have access to the underlying data of the 500 or so utilities that you referenced on using those Form EIA-861?
The raw data that's supplied at the EIA level is what I have.
So would it be correct to conclude that you don't know how each of those 500 utilities characterized incentive and non-incentive costs for purposes of that EIA form?
I know that it's all self-reported data, and there is going to be variation across utilities, no doubt.
So it's correct to conclude that you don't know how those 500 utilities characterized incentive and non-incentive costs, correct?
It would be a broad brushstroke, is what I would characterize. It's effectively what EIA is trying to state with that figure.
But you're saying that you can't conclude, or we shouldn't conclude that you had the information on how each of those companies defined incentive and non-incentive costs, correct?
I'm aware of.
Is that a yes or no?
Well, please give me a second, sir.
I'm sorry. Go ahead.
What I am aware of is the EIA data based off of a 6-year EIA data range. And what I've got is the company's own self-reported data for 6 years. Each year, the company's incentive, non-incentive range was below a certain threshold.
That wasn't my question, Dr. Mark. My question is it correct that you don't know how specifically these utilities defined incentive and non-incentive costs for purposes of that form?
I can't speak to the 500 plus utilities, sir.
In preparation for your testimony in this case, did you research previous decisions of the Missouri Commission that looked at the difficulty of comparing management efficiency of one utility to another?
I'm aware of, in general, the difficulty of that.
No, my question is, did you research the Missouri Public Service Commission decisions that address that topic?
Yes.
Which decisions did you reference?
Oh, did I reference or did I research?
I'm sorry, did you research?
In particular, rate cases, auditors, defining management expenses, and I guess that's the extent of what I know, as that being a hot topic in terms of rate cases in front of the commission.
So you don't recall any specific rate cases you researched on that topic?
I can't think of one, but off the hand.
So you're not familiar with the decisions that abandon the practice of adjusting rate of return determination for management efficiency because of the difficulty of assessing management efficiency?
Objection assumes facts, not evidence.
Can you restate that question, Mr. Fisher?
Yes, sir. I was just asking, so he wasn't familiar with the decisions that by the Missouri Public Service Commission that abandoned the practice of adjusting the rate of return determinations for management efficiency because of the difficulty of assessing management efficiency.
Any commission decision with that conclusion would speak for itself. Mr. Fisher's question is coming out of left field and not citing to any other. We have no idea what decision he's citing to. There's no decision like that in the record previously. This is why I'm saying it's assuming any type of conclusion that's not in evidence.
I'm going to overrule because he asked only if Dr. Mark was aware of them. Go ahead, Dr. Mark.
I'm not.
Thank you, Dr. Mark. That's all the questions I have. Oh, it looks like I'm getting a timeout here. I think, is it Tracy? Tracy, are you, or who is that Lisa?
No, yeah, Lisa's our court reporter today.
I have a young lady that's trying to give me a timeout, I think, on the monitor here.
I believe she's on mute.
She had said previously that she doesn't use computer audio but calls in. Her line has probably dropped.
And we've come so close to doing this without computer issues today.
Let me try email real quick.
Can you guys hear me?
Yes.
Sorry, I had to get my video on. So I got the objection, and then I got Mr. Hall's saying he's coming out of left field. I have no idea what he's citing to. And then you can continue, Mr. Hall. I'm terribly sorry. It just hung up.
For the purposes of the record, the judge permitted the question to proceed. And then, Dr. Mark, if you would, could you repeat your answer to Mr. Fisher's question?
I believe it was no.
And then I think, or if I didn't, I meant to thank the witness for his patience, and that was all the questions I had.
Thank you, Mr. Fisher. And that takes us to redirect Mr. Hall.
Dr. Mark, do you recall your conversation with the judge as to a distinction between a 50-50 ratio and a 55-45 ratio?
I do.
Do you agree with me that one difference between those two ratios is that if you have a 55-45 ratio of non-incentive to incentive spend, then literally most of the energy efficiency dollars would be non-incentive versus incentive spend?
Right. And, I think the characterization that I said was in my testimony was when we approve, $100 million in energy efficiency budget, we announced that we're expecting that money goes primarily to energy efficiency.
Dr. Mark, Mr. Fisher went on to ask you about Avergee's categorization of incentive and non-incentive costs compared to other utilities. To your knowledge, has Avergee attempted to compare its categorization of non-incentive to incentive costs compared to the other utilities that were analyzed in the EIA report?
No.
And Dr. Mark, do you know of Avergee changing its policy as to the categorization of incentive versus non-incentive costs over the review period, or the entirety of cycle 2?
No.
Over cycle 1?
No.
Your Honor, I have no further questions.
Thank you, Mr. Hall. Dr. Mark, that does it for your testimony. You are excused. Thank you.
Thank you, Judge.
Everyone, we are at the end of the hearing. I have a few announcements, and then I will ask for any other comments from council. As to exhibits, I, the regulatory law judge, will take the responsibility of sending the exhibits to the exhibit email address for our marking and official addition into the record. We have 2 outstanding exhibits that are yet to be submitted. Avergee is going to submit the errata sheet for Mr. Files' testimony, and that is not due until Thursday, April 29th. And staff is going to submit as an exhibit all applicable tariffs for both Avergee Metro and Avergee West during the time period of April 1, 2018 through December 31st, 2019, all tariffs that were in effect, even if partially during that time period. I will follow up with a written order to that effect. And I'd also like to allow for 1 day to object to those 2 exhibits. Is that going to be enough time? Let me know now.
That's what I was going to ask you. Did you say Thursday for the MIA tariff from staff, Judge?
Yes, sir.
Week from today? Okay.
Yes, sir.
Do we have an exhibit number pre-assigned to them that I can reference when I file those?
Let's do that right now. I believe staff, you are at 106 is your next number?
I believe so, Judge, yeah.
So be it. Exhibit 106 is the tariffs submitted by staff due Thursday, April 29th. And Avergee.
I think it's Exhibit 7, Judge.
Thank you. You're at 7. And that is the errata sheet for Mr. Files' testimony. And then I would like to set a deadline for objections to those 2 exhibits as 1 day later. So Friday, April 30th. I'd like to hear if that gives everyone enough time to read over and file a thoughtful objection. If not, we can change it to a Monday.
Your Honor, I would ask for Monday, given the length of the entirety of the tariffs, but I don't think any more time would be necessary.
Sold. We'll change the objections due Monday. Let me find out what date that is. May 3rd. And again, I will follow up with a written order memorializing this. Okay. Are there any other matters that need to be addressed? All right. Seeing none, this evidentiary hearing is adjourned and we are off the record. Thank you all.